Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
In Mughal history, law was more or less conflated with the state. And on the other hand, we had the huge and really exciting Islamic law historiography, in which law was conflated with jurisprudence. It's very interesting, actually, this these two imaginations of law, because if you think of law always conceives of two things anyway. One is norms, and you could equate that with jurisprudence, and the other is force, because norms without force are not law, they're just norms.
In this episode of BIC Talks, author and historian Dr. Prachi Deshpande talks to fellow author and historian Dr. Nandini Chatterjee about the story of how she assembles a living, breathing world through her book, Negotiating Mughal Law, a Family of Landlords across 3 Indian empires. And now, over to Prachi to contextualize the conversation.
Thank you, Lekha. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss a book that I have enjoyed very much with a scholar whom I respect greatly and from whom I've learned a great deal over the last few years. I'm here to discuss Negotiating Mughal Law, a Family of Landlords across 3 Indian empires with Professor Nandini Chatterjee. Professor Chatterjee is a historian with wide-ranging interests in the Mughal and colonial era periods of South Asian history, legal history, and family history. Her first book, The Making of Indian Secularism, Empire, Law, and Christianity, published in 2011, examined legal, theological, political, and racial debates in the making of a minority religious community of Indian Christians in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is one of the crucial works for a historically nuanced understanding of Indian secularism as enshrined in the Constitution and our legal processes. She has also studied legal processes in the British Empire more broadly, especially the Privy Council, which used to be the final court of appeal of the British Empire. Today, however, we will discuss in detail her second book, Negotiating Mughal Law, which came out last year in 2020. This is a lively, erudite, and thoroughly enjoyable history of one family from Malwa in central India, which held substantial lands and various administrative offices in the Mughal Empire, and negotiated over several generations with 3 regimes, the Mughals, the Marathas, and the British as well. It is in many ways a classic history from below, populated with real people and colourful individuals in both spectacular and everyday situations, which tells a riveting story, even as it opens up many important questions for scholars and students of Mughal history and historical scholarship more broadly. The story of how Chatterjee reconstructed a coherent archive to tell such a micro-history of one family over such a long period of time is equally riveting, and I look forward to hearing her tell us that story today. So this book is a thought-provoking meditation on the nature of the historical archive, on how we read documents in different languages and scripts, and the historian's reconstruction of and responsibility to the past and the present. It's not surprising that Negotiating Mughal Law won the Peter Gonville Stein Book Award for 2020, which is awarded by the American Society for Legal History. So I hope that, the many questions and issues that I wish to raise in today's discussion will convey some of the excitement I felt when I first read Nandini's book, and which I returned to again and again in the course of my own work. And I encourage everyone tuning in to read it. It is accessible to all readers, academics and otherwise, not only in its lively prose style, but also published open source to read and download freely on the web by Cambridge University Press. So, Nandini, I thought we could address one by one all the different categories in the title of the book law, families and landlords, and the different empires, Mughal, Maratha, British. So let me begin by asking you about law and your conceptual approach to it as a historian in this book. You mentioned that you wish to push your readers to think of law as more than jurisprudence, as we usually think of it. You examine it as a mode of communication that draws on the judicial vocabulary but also redeploys it in different ways. And you use this approach to law to interrogate the binary of cosmopolitan and vernacular that is more familiar to us in the context of language politics and history. So I like how you say in the beginning of the book that this approach allows you to show that one didn't have to be very grand in the imperial hierarchy or travel very far to different places to become cosmopolitan. Persian language documentation actually brought a very cosmopolitan world home to small local spaces through the processes of Mughal law. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about this approach and how it has helped you think about Mughal law and early modern South Asia more broadly. How is law vernacularized in the Mughal Empire, if I were to put it differently?
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Prachi, and also for that beautiful question. Before I turn to answering the question, can I thank Bangalore International Center for organizing this event? It's such a delight and honor to be part of the podcast of this series. And it's really also a great honor and pleasure to be speaking about a book which is a labor of love, together with a friend, but also a South Asianist whose work I admire so very highly and who's taught me so much about South Asia during and after the process of writing this book. I think Prachi and I share, if I may say so, a common love of languages. And Prachi has framed her question about law in terms of literature on languages in South Asia, the cosmopolitan and the vernacular. The way you ask this question, Prachi, is how is law vernacularized in the Mughal Empire? Allow me to step back for a minute and actually reframe that question to some extent, which is, what is law at all? When we think of something being vernacularized, I think we have a fairly clear idea of what it is that is being vernacularized. So let me give you an example from language that you are, of course, very familiar with. So we have seen a lot of really interesting literature on the Persian, for example. So the idea that the language Persian became widely used far beyond its zone of native speech and was used for administration, for literary works, etc., from what's known as the Bengal to Bosnia complex. And in that process got localized, got mixed with local languages, local phonetic patterns, local grammatical patterns, local ideas, etc., is what we would think of when we think of the cosmopolitan and the vernacular, or something being vernacularized, the Persian cosmopolitan language being vernacularized in this case. However, when I started writing this book, I didn't actually think that I knew what Mughal law was, or indeed what law was that was getting vernacularized. I really had these two bodies of historiography, which very bluntly one can put in this fashion, and not entirely accurately. However, in Mughal history, law was more or less conflated with the state. And on the other hand, we had the huge and really exciting Islamic law historiography, in which law was conflated with jurisprudence. It's very interesting, actually, this these two imaginations of law, because if you think of law, law always conceives of two things anyway. One is norms, and you could equate that with jurisprudence, and the other is force, because norms without force are not law, they're just norms. And that you could equate with the state. So here I had a task of how do I actually identify Mughal law and where do I find it? Mughal historiography would have me find it mainly in state orders, so the occasional, what we would now call executive orders. They would find it in books of rules for administration, and they would find it in policy. Any modern legal scholar would, however, not call any of this law. They would call it state behavior. or state action or policy, which, as we know, can deviate from law. On the other hand, I would have Islamic legal scholars who would like to conflate law, or at least derive law mainly from books of jurisprudence. I felt that none of these fully addressed what law must have been in the Mughal Empire. So I took what might be called a kind of derivative approach from the materials. I had a look at the kinds of documents that people would produce when they went about doing things that we might think of as lawful, as mundane as repaying a debt, something larger like buying a house, or indeed committing a crime and being punished for it. What sorts of documentation was being produced in that process? And what does that documentation itself tell us about what consisted of law? Derivative questions from that were, what did people call the law? What was the word for law? And these are the answers that I came up with when I tried to put these two things together. One is that people considered as law the entire agglomerate, if you like, which derived from state orders, which derived from administrative procedures and laws and regulations, but also from very, very widely and well-known Islamic legal concepts, as well as local custom. All that together made up Mughal law. You cannot separate the politics from the law, but neither can you conflate the law with politics entirely. Does that answer your question at all, Prachi?
Yes, it does actually, and it opens the way to my next question very nicely, which is to ask about a Mughal social history. How do you see yourself doing a different kind of Mughal social history, through these overlapping spheres, sort of a middle ground between jurisprudence and state practice or politics that you sort of found yourself in? Because Mughal social history or socio-economic history, as we learned it when we were in graduate school, was about very familiar figures that are in your book as well. The zamindar, agrarian surplus extraction, the administrative figure of the kanungo, and so on. But you infuse these dry administrative figures and the sort of broad processes that we read about with life and energy in new ways. So how have developments in Mughal historiography and beyond, in Ottoman or in wider sort of Persianate or Islamic history, sort of helped you make the particular arguments or approaches that you take in your book? So would you speak a little bit about your approach to social history?
I will come to wider inspirations in a minute, but I'll try and delineate my idea of social history in this case. Yes, so like you, I read the same Mughal social historiography. I found it deeply inspiring. First of all, Professor Habib's work and all that work that clusters around it, in a sense. I found it exciting because it demystified the rich and the powerful. And although that might be passé now, like in a sense in which we live in a post-socialist neoliberal world, it was very, very exciting as a young student to actually think that an empire did not just consist of the dynasty, and nor just the nobility that clustered around the dynasty. The fact that you actually think about the great and glamorous Mughal Empire by thinking about the villages, the workers, the peasants, the landless peasants, etc., I thought that was inspiring. The other thing, and I have to say that I still find that more inspiring than work that continues, to my mind at least, somewhat repetitively, to concentrate on the princes and the princesses and the courts and the great sheikhs and so on. To me, it seems that Mughal history, to some extent in recent times, has become, in a sense, more socially conservative. And by that, I mean that we seem to be going back, in fact, to a more great men version of Mughal history, so that we keep debating endlessly about the moral virtues or vices of, say, one person, Aurangzeb. All said and done, that person may have been the emperor, but they were one person. They weren't the entire empire. And I do think that there's a regression in focusing on just one or two or even 100 people in this fashion. The other thing that continues to deeply inspire me about older Mughal historiography, and by this I go right back to the British Orientalists themselves, such as Morland, for example, and his article on the Mansab system that he wrote for the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, I think in the 1930s, which was then, of course, corrected and updated by Professor Habib and then Shirin Musbi as well. I just greatly admire, number one, that linguistic skill, number two, that kind of archival persistence, and number three, that sheer hard work in trying to piece together from little details a big narrative, rather than approaching a single chronicle and applying what might appear to be relatively uncritical lenses to extract information about the empire from these chronicles. So these are two things that have continued to inspire me. I think of myself as a little sources historian. I don't do big texts in a sense. I like the little pieces. I like sweeping them up, putting them together like a jigsaw puzzle. So that does inspire me. What about social history then? I think I have already started talking about it, as in why I think actually looking beyond the courts and the most important of shrines is inspiring to me, because I like to hear about other people. But here is where I remained frustrated when I was looking at Mughal social historiography. I wasn't finding enough about the personalities, the lives, the interests of the people, not even those whom we may call subaltern, but actually people who were more of the middling sorts. How did they go about constructing a career for themselves? We do have some excellent studies, for example, of great Mughal nobles, about how they emigrated, for instance, from Iran to India, how they shaped their careers, etc. But could you write a story like that about not particularly important zamindar in a not particularly important part of the Mughal Empire? And if you did, what sorts of stories would come out? You talked, Prachi, about inspiration from other historiographies. Ottoman historiography is, in this sense, more into, if you like, social history than in this sense than the Mughal Empire is, perhaps. But my true inspiration here actually comes from English social history. And it does really go back to the work that E.P. Thompson was doing, for instance, in the works such as not just those kind of about English customs to do with law, etc., but also with personalities. So if you look at Whigs and Hunters, we have such strong images of the people who blacked their faces, who went out poaching, and who gave these brave speeches before being hanged to death. I wanted pictures like that for our Mughal history. So that's my vision of social history, which is peopled, if you like, by personalities.
That's wonderful. So tell our listeners a bit more about your particular archive of documents, your people, and how you piece together the story of Pursutam Das and his family right down to Amit Chaudhary today. I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing that story again. But I also wanted to just highlight this piece at the end of your book, where you say it's very evocative. The ghosts of the past talk to their peers. We are like little children eavesdropping through floorboards, trying to make out what the grown-ups are really saying. Meanings are lost in the process of Chinese whispers, in which words pass through multiple layers of articulation and scribing, and it is a struggle to imagine, let alone reconstruct, the many hands that have been at work across generations in the producing of a single scrap of paper, such as the Nishan that this book began with. As a microhistorian, I see it as my duty to pursue what seems unusual or odd about those half-heard whispers, not silence and squeeze them into what we think we already know about the great processes of history. I mean, this is really, I think, both a very evocative sort of description of the historian's craft, but also what is at stake, and what we might know, what we might not be able to know when we start researching the past. So, to continue your metaphor, can you introduce us to some of these ghosts? What were the floorboards or the many hands through which some of these sounds filtered through to you? I mean, so much of our historiography these days is about reassessing already known material through fresh analytical frameworks. And of course, there's a great value to that. I don't wish to dismiss it in any way. But that element of surprise or pleasure in the individual story, or just discovering new material, which is also another feature of microhistory, has sort of taken a back seat. And your book brings back that joy most effectively. So tell us a bit more about the actual documents which are at the heart of this book.
It's been such a fool's quest for so many years, in fact, that it's so very nice to actually get the chance to tell this story. I have told it, as you said, to some extent. Again, thanks to another wonderful scholar's encouragement, and I'm talking of Samira Sheikh here, the eminent historian of Gujarat, who encouraged me to write that final chapter where I tried to lay out how I brought this archive together. This is not something that historians normally do, and I think that that's a miss compared to anthropologists in particular. I think that maintaining that kind of authoritative distance from our sources can actually be something unproductive, because it creates this impression, if you like, that an archive is always out there for you to pick up information from. Unless we show the process, how can scholars who are trying to do the same thing or similar things actually do this task themselves? So let me tell my story, first of all, about putting some of this archive together, and then I'll give some examples about stuff that remain half understood. And so when I started learning Persian, that was in 2011, and when I had acquired more or less a competence in reading, I turned up in Delhi with the hope that I would find some sort of legal registers, just of the kind that you had in the Ottoman Empire, and also the kind that you see in the British colonial case, that there would be these long series of records of various legal disputes, etc., and I could just track social history stories out of them. I went to the National Archives, of course, and I was completely deflated by finding that there are no such registers remaining, or maybe ever in existence, in the Mughal Empire. What I found instead were these individual scraps, and they're literally scraps. The average Mughal legal document of the kind that I'm talking about is something like an A5 sheet of paper, usually yellowed with age and torn at the edges, written in Persian, but in scribal hand Persian, which is known as the broken script or shikasta, and sometimes in combination with other archaic forms of languages such as Hindi, but it can be Marathi, Bengali, what have you. And they seem to be not about law at all, but about some very mundane activities, like somebody takes a loan, somebody buys a house. How has any of this got to do with my bigger question of what was law in the Mughal Empire, and how could I ever construct a story out of it? So what I found in the National Archives, after several days of heartbreak, if you like, was that there are series in the National Archives that are known as the Acquired Papers series. These are in the Oriental Reading Room on the 4th floor, or as it used to be. And in there, what we have actually are the collation of several family collections, which have been put together in an amorphous mass of documents, about 10,000 documents strong. How does one make any sense out of that amorphous mass of documents? And here is again where you actually ride on the shoulders of greats of the past. So there were archivists who were working from the 1950s who had created short but excellent summaries of all these records and then published them in chronological order in catalogs that were attached to these acquired papers. Unfortunately, however, the archiving practices meant that these collections of papers which had come from individual families had been taken apart and put together again chronologically. So they had lost their collection identity. So what I had to do at this point was to read the description of all 10,000 of those documents in order to begin to identify some figures, some patterns. And one name kept popping out to me again and again. And here's your ghost or ancestor number one, the name Pursutam Das. And Pursutam Das, it seems, was active in Dhar around Malwa, which is southwest corner of Madhya Pradesh now, in the mid 17th century. I started finding out that Pursutam Das was the son of Mohan Das, he was the nephew of Chandrabhan, he was the father of Hamir Chand, etc. I worked out his relatives, I found out who he was opposed to, I found out what he was doing. And by the way, the names, the titles of the posts he held were Chaudhary as well as Kanungo. And here was bell number one. I was thinking that Chaudhary is supposed to be a zamindar. A Kanungo is supposed to be a revenue record keeper. We knew from Mughal historiography that these are supposed to be two completely separate posts. Usually the castes are different as well. So how come the same person was holding both posts? We knew from other historiography that in fact sometimes the posts could be combined, but that would be a sign of some kind of degeneration or corruption in the area. So I wanted to kind of find out how did they acquire those posts together. And I started reading through the documents that pertained particularly to this family and found out that actually they had acquired the position because the family had lent themselves out to the regime, by which I mean the local noble in charge of the area, ridding the region of highwaymen who had taken over the high roads and had disrupted traffic. And having come to the regime's attention in this way, they had acquired various formal posts in the region, which then led to various land grants, which led to further positions and in speculation in those positions, leading to further enlargement of their portfolio. So the picture I was getting out of this was much less that of a state making appointments all the way down to the village level by some sort of impersonal mechanism based on skills, and much more of a bottom-up entrepreneurship of people who were go-getters, people who dabbled in various things, including bearing arms, to occupy a variety of state positions and then turning that into property. So I found about 80 documents, a bit more, in the National Archives, but I was not satisfied. I was thinking, are there more that this family had? And then I went back to that irreplaceable reference book on the Mughal Empire, the Agrarian Structure by Professor Irfan Habib, and I found this one footnote, which is that there's a collection of documents related to some zamindars of Dhar, once again that place, in a museum in Kuwait. Now, I had a friend in Kuwait. I couldn't go to Kuwait at that point. So I asked my friend, the excellent legal historian of the Indian Ocean, Fahad Bishara, whether he could help. And of course, Fahad says that he knows everyone in Kuwait. So he contacted a friend in the Dar al-Asar al-Islamiyya Museum in Kuwait. And very soon, because of the generosity of the staff at the museum, I received 47 documents, again, very clearly pertaining to this family, same names, even same hands in some cases, which complemented my already growing archive. And the final stage was when I thought I should really go to Dhar and see this place. And here is what actually happened. I turned up in Dhar, which, as you know, is a small but busy city with ancient heritage. And I went round and round with no idea how I could possibly find a family that had lived there 300 years ago. I tried mapping out some of the village names in these documents, one of which was Ahu. And we drove to Ahu, which is not connected by a metal road. We turned up in Ahu, and the only significant building there was a Jain temple, about which I was hopeful, but nothing happened there. Then my husband went to one of the grocery stores and said, "Is there anybody knowledgeable about the history of this place?" And with great Malvi politeness, the gentleman said, "Well, what are you looking for?" And we said, "We are looking for somebody who lived here 300 years ago." And again, with great Malvi grace, the gentleman at the shop said, "Well, maybe my dad can help." So dad turned up and chatted to me and said, "Well, it's going to be hard to find somebody like that, but maybe you ought to talk to Mr. Karan Singh Pawar." It turned out that Mr. Karan Singh Pawar, who had been the MLA of Dhar in the past, was actually the direct descendant of the Pawar Maratha Sardar family who had gained control of Dhar in the early 18th century and had subsequently become a princely state under the British. So I got in touch with Mr. Karan Singh Pawar, who was extremely generous and opened his house to a stranger. And I asked him, do you know anybody who might be descendants of people called Pursutam Das, Hamid Chand? And he said, I think I may have the man for you. And he picked up the phone, connected to someone, and said, please do speak to this person. And at the other end of the line was Amit Chaudhary, to whom my gratitude is endless. And Amit Chaudhary is direct descendant of Pursutam Das, who was Zamindar of Dhar in the mid-17th century. And I spoke to Amit Chaudhary, and he said he recognized all the names and that there were boxes of documents under the bed in his Haveli, which is known as the Bada Raula. And anybody knew this place. So I turned up at Bada Raula. I met his mother, the now late Abha Thakurani, and she took out these boxes for me, and I photographed a further 50 documents. This is not to say that the archive is complete, because even now, of course, there were other documents, and I could see that there are other documents of, for instance, black sheep in the family who did things that the family did not approve of. So a name that crops up only in 3 documents, 4 actually, sorry, in the book, in this collection, is a name called Muhammad Asad. I don't want to give the story away, but I will say this much. If you want to find out the story of Muhammad Asad, he was a man who in the early 18th century claimed that he was a member of this Hindu family. And you have to read the book to find out what happened afterwards.
Okay, with that cliffhanger, I should just mention that I hope some people who are interested in Maratha history, students of Maratha history who work with Marathi documents from the 17th and 18th century are listening to this, because this is really the kind of work that we also need for Maratha history, which is structured around such family archives, many of which were put together. And the story is quite similar to the one that you tell, about how certain kinds of categories were privileged when these documents were first collected and transcribed and catalogued. Chronology, of course, is one. The other one is also political documents, right? Those which are relevant to treaties or to battles, or which will help stitch together a kind of larger Maratha history. But in the process, sort of smaller documents or those which pertain to this kind of everyday social history that you're talking about, sale deeds or all sorts of other family relationships and so on, those kind of fall by the wayside, and they're either not printed or catalogued or even sort of retained, but are basically sort of left to rot in the past. So how to actually kind of look for these gaps? I'm really glad to hear your reconstruction of this family archive, however incomplete conceptually it may be, and I grant that. But nevertheless, the fact that this kind of family documentation can be actually put together in a coherent way to attempt a family history, I think is very inspirational for Maratha history students. And I hope people interested in Maratha history, researchers, young scholars, will read your book and listen to this discussion as well, because a lot of what you describe for these Mughal documents in the National Archives, as well as Kuwait and in the family's possession in Dhar, apply to many such smaller and bigger families within Maharashtra as well. And just like chronology becomes one overarching kind of thematic to organize these documents and decide what is retained and what is left out, political history or military history becomes another major thematic through which certain kinds of documents are privileged, and a lot of everyday history that is relevant to getting a kind of flavor of the past or how ordinary people lived in the past then is kind of set aside. Some of which, of course, is lying uncatalogued in archives, in bundles, and so on, in state and private archives. And I'm hoping that your discussion and your kind of very critical discussion of these materials will also inspire students to do the same with a lot of household archives within Maharashtra as well. So that's something I definitely wanted to kind of highlight in the discussion.
I think it's actually particularly suitable, by which I mean this methodology, for Maratha history, about which I have no expertise, but I have actually looked at some of the materials that are available with great longing. Because I think what we have, for instance, at the Bharat Itihas Samsodhan Mandal in Pune, are in fact, in many cases, exactly this kind of family collections. And the reason that they are so is that the official documents, if you like, of the Peshwa-led Maratha Empire were in Shanivarwada, as you know, and they got, and also in Nana Fadnavis's house, and they got captured by the British and then kept out of the reach of Indian researchers, whereas in a story that you yourself tell so evocatively, and which also occurs in Deepesh Chakrabarti's book on Jagannath Sarkar, there's these activist historians who go out and collect materials specifically from these kind of landed lineages in order to create, if you like, a people's archive of the Maratha Empire. So I think, like, actually, it is a bit of a loss that this people's archive, if I may call it that, has in fact again turned into the story of a state, such that we ignore who are the people who had actually created these document sets. And I think that we need to do that, not just because we need to add the colorful stories of little people to the broader stories of regimes. I think we need to actually ask the question of who created these records, who preserved them, in whose interests were these records, in order to know how documentation really took place, but also how state processes really took place in a regime, in a period. If we don't do that, we actually end up with a very synthetic and anachronistic view of what the state itself is. And I think that's a fantasy view of a completely centralized, impersonal state which controls every bit of its functioning. And it actually deprives us of that people's history that actually is also the history of the state. And to give one example of the kind of damage that is done by our preconceptions, apart from this issue of ignoring like where the documents come from. So one of the common practices I found in Maratha history, for example, in archiving, is to separate out the Persian documents from these family collections from the other documents, which are the Marathi language documents. The problem with this is that it creates this kind of separate archive of Persian documents, which seem to derive only from Muslim regimes, and then whether it be the Deccan Sultanates, which is the case in the majority, or the occasional Mughal documents as well. And then there are the kind of Marathi documents. But the reality is that these were all documents which were created, acquired, and preserved by these Maratha lineages in that region. And the separation that people have done in the process of their archiving is what has damaged that archive. And I think we need to regain that coherence all over again. And the facilities are really there. Unlike with the Mughals, and much more than the Mughals actually, with the Marathas, we can do this because the documents are actually there.
Yeah, I think actually you're absolutely right. And in that separation of Persian materials from Marathi materials, or in other regions Persian materials from other sort of vernacular languages, in this archiving has of course created a kind of artificial monolingual sort of barrier between different scripts and language materials. But it's also sort of prevented us from thinking really about what multilinguality was like in the early modern world, right? In terms of skill, in terms of social sphere, in terms of attitude, and in terms of actual everyday documentation practices. So you talk a lot about multilinguality in the book through your legal documents, right? And I was wondering maybe we could speak a little bit more about that. Through the actual presence of paper on different languages and scripts, to translations and transcriptions, and the presence of marginalia. How did you approach these aspects of your documents, and how has the concept of the Persianate influenced you when you worked with them? I'm thinking here of Niall Green's recent argument to look more carefully at Persian writing or Persographia rather than just Persophonia, alongside other languages and scripts across the Persianate world, and the different relationships of power and politics that this Persographia produced. And I know I found it very influential in sort of thinking about my own multilingual materials and the presence of Persian within the Marathi, Modi archive that I look at. But how do you relate to this argument, and what do you think has been its historiographical usefulness for you?
I will start by, I think, going back to my kind of own linguistic and emotional response, because I think scholarship is in the end also about emotions. I look at this kind of multilingual material, which has been so denigrated ever since the growth of language purism movements from the 19th century. I look upon them with a lot of love. I find them really, really beautiful and really the measure of the cosmopolitan. So when I look at a sale deed, which is written in completely formulaic Persian with some Hindi words, which are, let's take an instance, in this case, Hindi say, included and spelt out in the Perso-Arabic script, followed by a Nagari script rendering of that. And we find it even difficult to identify whether the language in the Nagari script is really Hindi or Persian, written in Hindi. I look upon all that with a lot of interest in all the parts of that document. And I look upon the whole thing not as a Mongol monstrosity as it began to be seen from the 19th century in need of purification, but as something cosmopolitan and beautiful. Because what is the cosmopolitan if it only consists of a few highly privileged princes, princesses, and literators being able to speak and write in a few languages? I think cosmopolitan comes down to villagers being able to understand a variety of languages because they have the vocabulary, they have the phonetics, they have the ability to identify documents, that they do not need the entire languages in order to operate in a number of languages. So I think it's opposite actually in this case. To give an example here. So my mother-in-law does not know English. She knows, however, Marwari, Hindi, and Bengali. In the Indian context, she would not be considered cosmopolitan. To me, however, she is cosmopolitan, much more so than a child, for example, who's encouraged by parents to only speak in English. And there are many such, as we know, in some urban households in India. Why is this considered cosmopolitan, but that not considered cosmopolitan? That my mother-in-law's cosmopolitanism is the thing that I find most emotionally, but also intellectually rewarding. That's answer number one. Number two, against purification. I'm also inspired by the Bengali poet Nazrul Islam's lament at the mid 20th century effort by Bengali language purists to cure Bengali of Perso-Arabic influence. And there was a debate over the word khun, which means blood, and whether khun is an appropriate word for Bengali language. And Nazrul insisted that it was, but when actually other equally famous literators said that it wasn't, that it was a foreign word, he also pointed out that there were so many other words in Bengali, for example, adalat, which comes from adalat, which is an Arabic origin word. How would you actually, speak Bengali at all without all those languages? Purism can only lead to impoverishment. So you ask me, like, how does the concept of the Persianate inspire me? It inspires me to look at those messy details in situ with equal love for the Indic languages and scripts and the Perso-Arabic languages and scripts. It encourages me to pay attention to the Arabic elements. My Arabic is that of an advanced beginner, but it encourages me to pay attention to the Arabic formulae as different from the Persian, as different from the Urdu, and to delight in the combinations that are produced in situ in our Hindustan, if you like. The difference with some of the Persianate work, which is not what Nile Green recommends, by the way, is that when Persianate is done as Persianate plus, and especially with the fear, if you like, of Indic languages, scripts, and the joyful proliferation of languages that we have in South Asia, then I think we lose the richness of what the Persianate really is. And I think the way to think about that is the way that we now think about Anglophone, or indeed to a lesser extent of the Francophone these days. Who actually measures literature written in English only in terms of some sort of Queen's English? That would be regressive. If that is regressive, then why on earth should we actually judge the uses of Persian, for example, in South Asia by some sort of external standard of present-day Iranian pronunciation or spelling or literary standards? So my answer is to celebrate the mess. That is what I think multilingualism is about, and also what cosmopolitanism is about.
I'm thinking about impoverishment, and I think you're right. I mean, I'm also thinking of our own skills. Some of us are growing up in multilingual households, and we're lucky to pick up several languages just along the way in family and in neighborhoods. But the hard work of actually learning a lot of languages and scripts for advanced research is something that I think many of the scribes that you work with, or sort of who produce the documents that you are working with, may not have had to do, or would have had to do in a very different way. So it's interesting to contrast our own sort of relationship to documents and languages and scripts with the kind of scribes that we study. And I wonder if scholarly collaboration is one way to sort of reconstruct, that embodied multilingual skill that we read about, or that we work with in the 18th and 17th century. I remember when we came up with this modified transcription schema for the journal issue, in the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, the one that you recently edited. And one of the problems that we faced when we produced this modified transcription schema was the letter order for different languages, because these letter orders are different across Persian, Hindi, Marathi, and Bengali, and we had to decide which one to privilege, right? And we decided with Persian in the end, but I think it was a very good exercise that made us realize the sort of modern importance of these grammar and linguistic discourses, which put phonological orders and alphabets at the very heart of language identities, in a sense, and went against or counter to the kind of messiness of the Persianate or the messiness of the Persographic environment that existed at the time. So that was something actually that I really enjoyed in the process of working on that issue with you as well. So to follow up this question about multilinguality or about cosmopolitanism, I'm wondering whether we should speak about the Marathas first or about the historian's craft again, and perhaps we should speak a bit more about the construction of the book before we get to the Marathas. So you organize the book thematically around categories such as contractors, transactions, disputes, invaders, etc., and you also have a kind of passionate methodological manifesto at the end about the relationship between history and memory and the relationship of individuals and lineages to larger structures. And you say that an ethical charge is very important for a family history, right, which retains some memory of the history that you excavate in the book. How is this ethical charge, you think, different from the one that historians might retain when working with documents retrieved from an official state archive? So I'm thinking, if all of your documents had been found at the National Archives or in Kuwait, rather than dispersed and partly with the family, how would you have approached it differently? Would you have approached it differently? I mean, you've shown us that household collections allow us to decenter the archive with a capital A, which we associate in the modern period with the state-managed public record office and so on. But how must the historian negotiate commitments to alternative locations and dispersed locations? Does the way in which you organize the book via the documents and the thematics kind of help you engage this issue?
Actually, there's a two-part answer to this. The organization of the book has less to do with my engagement with a family in possession of some of the documents, and more to do with my conception of what I was doing in the first place. So let me answer that one first, then I'll go on to the issue of the ethical charge. So as I said at the beginning, I wanted to write a social history which was alive with people. And the thematics are actually, in a sense, visualizations or conceptualizations of dramatis personae, if you like. So the book, without trying to be a novel, does not try to expunge the drama that I at least saw in those documents. And it is those things, the contractor, the warrior, the invader, that you actually see, and the judge, of course, that you see reflected in those chapter titles. So that's really a reflection of my view of social history, which I would have done no matter where I found the documents. In terms of the question of ethical responsibility when one uses documents that remain in the possession of individuals and of families, this is something that I continue to work on. And here I want to say a huge thanks once again to the family that actually allowed me to work with their documents with no restrictions whatsoever, and place such complete trust in me in interpreting those materials for my book, but also for multiple public audiences, as in this case. This is extremely rare because families wish to guard their own histories. They also wish to guard what they see are the records of that history. There's a lot of fear in sharing documents at all, even images of those documents, because there's a fear that something will be lost in the process. But there is enormous fear in letting external agents, such as myself, external individuals, interpret these documents. And I quite understand where that fear comes from, because the family does construct a story for itself, and it doesn't want that story to be disrupted or, in fact, thrown aside by somebody who claims to be an external expert. So in this case, what I did was I actually went out of my way in collaboration with Amit Chaudhary, whom I mentioned as descendant of the family, in trying to find out what the family's self-perception was. And I was particularly lucky that Amit kept looking, and among various kinds of fragmentary materials that he was able to unearth for me was actually a handwritten family history, which was undated, but by style, etc. It seems to have been produced sometime in perhaps the late 19th century. That, alongside various other family lore that we could put together, seemed to indicate that this family, which was caste-wise at least caste, saw itself as essentially Rajput. It saw itself as a martial family, part of the martial landscape that part of India is. So I didn't take that self-image and impose it in all the documents. I did maintain the plurality, if you like, of appearances of this family. Sometimes they were contractors, sometimes they were businessmen, sometimes they were just record keepers. But at other times, some of them, yes, they were warriors too. So I related the family's memory of itself, or shall we say, in accuracy, one part of that family's memory of itself to the bigger story. I made that part of the story, not the entire story. And if we can extrapolate from that, I think what we need to do with history is not actually abandon the scientific methods of archival research, of logical extraction of evidence from them, but we do need to ask that question of where did these documents come from, who created these documents. Otherwise, we are falling prey to other myths that are myths of the state, which are not necessarily any better than other kinds of myths. And we also need to take into account, not as replacing that other history, but as part of the broader history, collective and individual memories of the past. And I think we have excellent work done by yourself in your first book, Creative Paths, for example, which shows us the way in how we can actually scientifically, for want of a better word, deal with that kind of disputed, emotive, charged, collective as well as individuated memory as part of the materials that the historian works with.
So on this theme of memory, let me ask you. I mean, what do the Marathas do in central India? And what might we kind of learn from your book's perspective or your family's perspective about the Maratha memory in Dhar and central India more broadly? So I'm thinking on the one hand of Rani Lakshmibai in Jhansi, further northeast from Malwa, and how she's been memorialized both in Maratha history, local history by historians and literators like Vrindavan Lal Verma, who wanted to excavate a kind of memory of Bundelkhand, and of course Indian nationalist writing on 1857. And then there are the smaller states, Dhar and Devas, for example, which endure in local power but do not really figure in the commemoration of the Maratha or national pasts in quite that way. And since you are taking this kind of long durée perspective, I mean, would you see this as a triumph of local power over empire ultimately? Or is this really the modern Anglo-vernacular regime that edges out a kind of Maratha interregnum or past, from the broad story of Dhar in central India?
Right. So as you know, having worked with me actually especially on the Maratha section, not just the Marathi section of the archive, as you know, the documentation actually for the period when Dhar was under an independent Maratha state is very patchy. We have far fewer documents. We do have some, though, to tell us what exactly was going on. So it's Dhar state, which is under the one branch of the Puwar families, comes under British control by signing a treaty in 1818, which is the treaty itself is reproduced in John Malcolm's book on Central India. And John Malcolm at least claims that he saw a lot of documents to do with the Puar family's claims, which are not extant any longer as far as we know. And then we have a period of silence, at least in the archive that I have. And then Dhar emerges again. And in this case, we actually have a petition to colonial authorities by the Zamindari lineage in question, which were now subordinate to the Puwars as the new sovereigns, reasserting their rights. So what do the Marathas do in the area? So we have a document in the collection which I think dramatically presents one part of that regime change, which describes how three specific Sardars, the Puars, the Shindes and the Holkars, come in raiding and then take over the region, and how actually the Mughal Mansabdars, the lower level ones, and the lower level officials such as this lineage struggle to deal with that incoming power. What seems to happen is, in the majority of cases, it was a case of removing one regime and overlaying it with another. So the Puwars come in, but our lineage at least remains exactly as it was in the same place. What do the Marathas do in terms of changing the nature of administration? Well, it's again hard to tell because we don't have quite as many documents as that period, but you do have documents to do with the Kamavizdar, which is more or less the equivalent of the Jagirdar, right, for the Marathas. In that area, and that document actually is in a form of Hindi or Rajasthani, if you like, which we could call Malwi, and the written form is called Rangri. So it is another instance, if we talk of language use, of the Marathas, in fact, having, if you like, Hindi language administration, especially in central India, rather than a predominantly Marathi language administration. Marathi itself does make inroads, and we see that in a register book that we have extracts from the early 20th century. So in summary, then, what we do have accounts of are these, that the lineages that were in place, many of them remain in place. There is, in fact, a new Qazi family that comes in the late 18th century. And these are the Shahar Qazis of Dhar, whose records I have seen and who seem to be appointed in the time of the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, so late 18th century, and who actually continue as paid officials of the Puwar regime in Dhar. So not only do we actually have the old lineages in place, we actually have new families coming in, occupying the positions that used to be under the Mughals. Then you have the new kinds of officials coming in, such as the Kamavizdars, etc. You have new documentation patterns, at least for the state administration level. But at the lower level, once again, with house sales, etc., we see the continuity of Persian language documentation. We also have an extract from an akhbarat, which is like a newsletter, which is sent by a representative from the nearby other Maratha state, the Gwalior state, reporting on tumultuous political events that are taking place there. Now, akhbarats are associated primarily with the Mughals, but clearly that's another Persianate practice that continues under the Marathas. And then, of course, it comes under the British. So some of the changes, if you like, that happen, once again, are, if you like, in the formation and the rituals of elite formation. So the formation of the elites and the rituals of those formations. Now the elites go to specific schools which are meant for the sons of aristocrats instead of Persian, but actually initially alongside Persian, they start learning more of English. There is more focus on gun salutes, etc. And the other thing that actually happens, and this is something that I have not researched in great detail, but I do know something of it, which is actually the attempt by the Maratha regime to rediscover a Rajput past for itself. So the Pearl dynasty actually claimed to be not incomers into the area, but returnees. They claimed to be long-lost descendants of the Parmars, direct descendants of Raja Bhoj, the legendary Raja Bhoj of Dhar. And one of the pernicious side effects, if you like, of that was the work of the history department and history and archaeology department headed by a certain Lele in the early 20th century, which led to the discovery, if you like, of a Sanskrit inscription inside the Kamal Maula mosque, which led to the conclusion that this was Raja Bhoj's Saraswati Mandir. And so being designated as the Bhojshala. So currently, actually, this is one of those disputed places under the control of ASI. And it is no longer a functioning mosque. And heartbreakingly, in my view, Muslim worshippers are compelled to perform their prayers outside the mosque, which now has ticketed entry because it's a disputed site. So that is among one of the other kind of outcomes of Maratha rulership there.
Yeah, I think, the ways in which the Marathas try to both claim residency and originary sort of membership in central India, while also justifying their presence as an imperial presence in central India, is one of the more sort of ambivalent and torturous sort of aspects of Maratha historiography. In some of my work, what I've seen is when Marathi writing is being edged out of Gwalior and Indore and so on in the administrations in favor of Hindi, a lot of these Marathi scribes who are now sort of schooled in a modern historiography are not sure exactly how to claim this Maratha status, to say that they actually belong in central India, or to actually say that we need to be here because we brought imperial glory here. So it's a very kind of gray and ambivalent site for the Marathas, and thinking about what their legacy there is. So this is very interesting, the way in which the Puars sort of relate to the Rajput past and try to claim an even earlier history there for themselves. So let me now ask a final question, Nandini, about your effort through your ERC project and all of your colleagues in that project to put this vast documentation online. The work that you all have done to transcribe, translate these documents, scan them, and make them available for the general public, and perhaps end with some reflections about what that has meant for you as a scholar who's had to stretch your expertise really from reading seals on very old paper documents to digital humanities and tags and metadata and all of that, and how you've negotiated all of that, in sort of bringing the archive to a much wider public today, and also therefore bringing the conversation about history and archives and research to a much broader public.
So you and I had actually thought of producing a printed handbook of these documents, actually a sample of them, with their images, with their full transcription, which means typed out text in the original language, and full translation, so that anybody who actually wants to see what these kinds of documents are like, anybody from somebody interested in history to school children to advanced researchers can actually see these documents, use these documents freely. And also, if anybody wishes to learn how to read these documents, then they can do so by following these examples. We decided in the end to actually not do a publication in that form, but instead do a completely free online publication, because we felt that the whole idea was that if we have actually gone through this effort to produce this kind of process data, if you like, it should be freely available to everyone. There's no point actually putting another paywall between our research data and future researchers. So to that end, finally, I decided, at much greater expense, I should say, and for which I'm really grateful to the European Research Commission, to create a website. of these documents. Now, having said that, actually, it is then that I realized how superficially we often think about digitization. So we were only in the end about to digitize about 60 documents. We might increase that to 80. So the website is going to be called Law Forms. And the thing is that it's one thing to take photographs of documents and upload them somewhere, say a blog, and a completely different thing to actually prepare full range metadata, which means detailed descriptions of the documents, categorize the documents, and then actually type out the documents and categorize the text within the documents as well, as in this part is the seal, this part is the pious invocation, this part is just formalities, this part is the real content, etc., etc. For that, you need, and just to give a sense, even if you can read and type the script, an average A5 size document takes about 4 to 5 full days of work to type out to an acceptable level. It takes almost an equal amount of time to then encode it so that it can be displayed online together with translation. So given that amount of work, these are the number of documents that we were able to produce at the moment. But my aspiration really is that people will use this website, but they will also use this website in order to appreciate what they might have in boxes under their beds. Really, Mughal history, or indeed any history, our country's history, is actually not in the past, not for experts, not in archives. It's very often in our homes, and we have to appreciate it and preserve it and bring it out and share with others. That is the message that I hope to actually give, and the resource that I want to create with this website.
Thank you again, Nandini, for that very passionate methodological manifesto. I hope it does inspire a greater interest in family history and documents, your book, your website, this conversation. And I also hope that it inspires more people from the humanities and people more expert in these sorts of technologies to collaborate on bringing more such older documents into the electronic domain in a way that can be meaningfully used by more people. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I hope our listeners have too. That's it from me over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prachi, for being such a wonderful interlocutor. I always feel that the real mark of a great scholar is that they are able to understand other people's work better than they can sometimes, which you have done. So thank you so much. And thank you to Bangalore International Center for organizing this conversation.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.